Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government. Do you still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? Does anybody else see a problem here? If the government has nothing to hide, why are they so afraid to answer a few questions? This story does not add up.
Well, a few months ago, it made big news across the world. Here was the headline. The ultimate goal of the NSA is total population control. That's William Edward Binney. He's the former technical leader for intelligence with the NSA. That's at the very top of it. Before becoming a whistleblower in late 2001, after more than 30 years with the agency, Binney has been described as one of the best analysts and code breakers in NSA history. Binney continues to speak out about the NSA's data collection policies and continues interviews in the media. And again, it's amazing that he's so high level and has the courage to speak out despite their attempts to silence him. Exposefacts.org has some of his information there. I wanted to get him on the last few weeks. We're able to get him today because of headlines like this. Snowden, there's a holy S-word smoking gun revelation coming. Whistleblower says government believes it has information that would be the death of them all politically. Well, then please release it because we've got a bunch of totalitarians running things. And he told Wired Magazine that. William Binney just came out with a group that I know is associated with people high up in the government and top analysts like Ray McGovern. Ex-NSA director, U.S. intelligence veterans write open letter to Merkel to avoid all-out Ukraine war. Now the former ambassador to Russia has gone public saying the West is starting the war and has destabilized Ukraine. That's just the truth. So I want to get William Binney's breakdown on that. Also I want to talk to him about parallel construction where other agencies like the DEA are using NSA data totally illegally and then creating fake court cases so the courts don't know where they got the data. This is just beyond 1984. So that's some of what we'll talk about in the next hour. Coming up at the bottom of the hour, we've got your questions that you're tweeting to Real Alex Jones. We put a hashtag out there so you can tweet your questions to William Binney. We'll also take a few phone calls, specific questions for him. 800-259-9231. 800-259-9231. Specific questions for William Binney. Mr. Binney, you heard me throw out that grouping of questions. Would you like to answer one of those first, or what do you think is most important that's currently happening right now?
Well, to me, what NSA, all the data NSA is collecting and being used by the police forces is really the most threatening situation to our constitutional republic since the Civil War. So to me, that's the most important thing, because it affects everything we do. It involves everything that everybody in the country is doing. So I mean, that's contrary to the founding documents of this nation.
Well, you're absolutely right. Last year, we were given secret documents from Homeland Security sources in Seattle. They were putting up their own cell towers, letting the local police even have access to it, grabbing everyone's data. Now I see headlines in CBS News, you name it, going, no one knows what the mystery cell towers are, but it's not the government because it's illegal to do that. I mean, we know what's going on. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that's part of that is gathering information on movement of individuals. I mean, that's how you can track people moving around, by basically putting up false towers and getting everybody to ping off your tower. That way you know they're in the area. And you can monitor who they are and map them over time by the machine access codes that they have and the phone numbers and things. So it's not a matter of it's not a matter of them guessing anymore. They just track everybody, and it'd be a simple problem to align them, with a program compile them and track everybody individually, and all you have to do is point to them and say, where have you been for the last month or two, and you can see what you've been doing.
That's right. It's so good to talk to somebody that knows all of this and knows more than I even know, because I mean, I look at what's open source public every day. A decade ago, the British put these up in London as a beta test, as you know. They also did it in Berlin. They tracked everybody in real time for years. It's totally illegal. Now they're building this grid at billions of dollars of expense for their own internal communication system as well, cameras, microphones, live time tracking of the cell phones. And then when the public says, what are these? They go, gee, we don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you.
Exactly. Crazy. Wow. Tell folks what parallel construction is, and why did you, I mean, obviously you can't talk about a lot of it, but why did you leave the NSA when you were one of the top people, one of the directors of it?
Well, I left in October of 2001 because they started spying on everybody and assembling information on everyone in the United States. And it went first with phone numbers and then went into the Internet later on and very shortly thereafter. So it was very clear to me that they were pulling together all this knowledge as like a super Stasi state, basically. So NSA was becoming the new Stasi agency, you know. That's their new term, I guess. Never Say Anything is now the new Stasi agency, because even though their people are not necessarily using, they're assembling and making possible all this information and making it available to all the policing agencies of the federal government, and they in turn make it accessible to the local and state police. So it's really becoming a police state. That's exactly what East Germany was with the Stasi. And it was the primary reason why they did. That's why I left. So, I mean, that was the main reason I left, because I could see this coming. And parallel construction is the use of is how the police forces, federal, state, and local, use the NSA collected information, which fundamentally is not acquired with a warrant, and so therefore it is all inadmissible, directly inadmissible in a court of law. And so, therefore, what they do is they have to, whenever they find something through the NSA data, they direct local police force to arrest them, and then say, now you do a parallel construction by using what you would consider normal policing techniques and like requesting things with warrants and things like that, and you assemble that data, and then you use that data to substitute for the NSA data that was originally used to arrest them, and you substitute the parallel constructed data in the courtroom. which I've called perjury. They're lying to the courts, and they're subverting our entire judicial process. And that's what happens when you allow this kind of assembly of information that's so much power. It's like J. Edgar Hoover on super steroids. So this is not compatible with any form of democracy at all.
And whether it's Republican or Democratic administrations, Nixon or Obama, they all end up using the IRS, you name it, to persecute political enemies. Imagine what Hitler would have done with systems like this. These systems historically always end up getting abused. If you're just joining us, the former director of technical intelligence with the NSA, I've heard it described as one of the top 4 jobs there. So one of the heads of the NSA, William Edward Binney, is on with us right now. And I mean, a much bigger whistleblower, you could say, even though he hasn't released a lot of secret info, than Snowden. And so the media somewhat has tried to ignore him, but he's so big they can't. Without getting into anything that was classified, but we are dealing with open totalitarianism, so it's almost treason for any of us, even if something's classified, to not talk about it. I mean, what was it like to be in there? I mean, did they come in and say, okay, we're going to flip on all the switches and spy on everything now and focus on U.S. citizens and politicians? I mean, can you tell us, was there a moment or was it a process when you're there heading up, the NSA, and who comes into you? Was it the director of national intelligence? Who was it? Was it the president? Okay, we're now going to totally break the law and spy on everyone. And then you say, I'm out of here? Or how did that happen?
Actually, I was not supposed to know about this program at all, because I had told them that I was going to leave in early 2002. So I was not supposed to know about what they were doing. But the problem with that was that they had to use the programs that we had developed there under that I had helped form within the SIGINT Automation Research Center, which is my laboratory at the time. So they had to use those programs, which meant they had to use the computer programmers that had developed it for me to install it in another place and get it up and running, because they were the only ones who knew how to make the code, set it up, make it running, and get data flowing in and working. So when they did that, they kept it all very secret, even inside NSA. And the reason, of course, was because it was an impeachable act. I mean, after all, spying on the U.S. citizens was a violation of the FISA laws. They were keeping the courts out of it. They only informed 4 people in Congress, the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committee, one of which was Nancy Pelosi, and that's why she later on said that the impeaching George Bush is off the table, because she had agreed to these programs from the beginning. So they were keeping it very secret, even from Congress. They didn't want any opposition, because when that basically was the Total Information Awareness Program that was started in 2001.
Admiral Poindexter.
And if you remember, Admiral Poindexter came out in, I think it was 2003, advocating a TIA program, Total Information Awareness Program. And that's when everybody came down on it and terminated, and that's what Congress's reaction. So when they saw that reaction, they continued to see that they were, from their perspective, they were making the right decision by keeping it secret. It's just like their secret agreement their secret interpretation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act. The fellow who wrote the Patriot Act, Representative Sensenbrenner, has already gone publicly and said that he never intended them to be able to do what they are doing, this bulk acquisition of information by using that Patriot Act. Well, that's violating the intent of Congress, and yet they're still doing that, and they're not spelling out. They're afraid to spell out to the American people exactly what they're doing and what their interpretation is of these laws that allows them to do it. They simply are assuming that if the Congress keeps passing these laws, then that's tacit agreement with what their secret interpretation is. And they don't have the guts to come out and tell the American people out in the open what they're doing. So that's the real problem.
Well, you're right. That was a major, because I was on air at the time, when Poindexter wrote the op-ed for the New York Times called Total Information Awareness. He said, your credit card, what you eat, where you go, everything you do, when you go to school, everything will be tracked in live time or the terrorists will kill you. People went, whoa, this is 1984, and you want private companies to run this? No way. So there was a backlash. So they tried to openly sell that when it blew up in their face. As you said, they just went forward with it. But the biggest thing for me here is it's come out in England, as you know, that they've got the same system, and they use it against the parliament. The bureaucracy does. I mean, this is being used. This is not to stop al-Qaeda or ISIS. This is pointed directly to American people. And now we've gone from it being secret to it being public, and then nothing's being done. I mean, where do you see this going?
Yeah, well, I see this as a very sad state of affairs. This is not the America I grew up in. I tell you, I could never understand why people would tolerate this kind of stuff. I've been advocating, if these bozos keep reinforcing by passing the same laws over and over again, that we, the people, should fire them, get them out of office because they're incompetent and they're not living up to their oath of office. We need to get rid of them. I mean, it doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican. I mean, I'm not in. The party has nothing to do with it. It has to do with whether or not you subscribe to the foundations of this country.
Well, I remember listeners sent me the link to thomas.loc.gov in 1998 and said, look at this. He was an engineer. Engineers would feed me info. I mean, I had engineers that told me they had big hubs and all the telecoms listening to everything. They would bring me diagrams. I had no idea what it meant and stick it in shredder machines because I'm no engineer, but I've been exposing this since day one, having other whistleblowers on. But I remember seeing this information and finding it so hard to believe, but reporting on it, and now it's just out in the open. And I remember being sent documents that they had done a grant for Austin to put up 1,000+ hidden microphones to listen to people. And they even had an algorithm program running locally that the feds had paid for that was NSA technology that you and others developed, I'm sure, that was keyword. And it was all there in the federal grant, just admission of microphones, key logging or word logging, whatever you call it, And I went on air and covered it, and people couldn't believe it. Then a week later, the local paper ran a big story whitewashing it, going, no, it's gunshot detector microphones. But the grant said it was microphones to listen to people. And then now, this year, they announced nationwide they're putting microphones in, hidden in street sculptures. And it's in the Chicago Tribune, but they don't call it microphones. They go, the data clusters pick up wireless, environmental hazards, and listen to audio for signs of trouble. So it's just this mainlining of a 1984. Mr. Binney is a former director of one of the major areas of the NSA. I mean, microphones hidden is 1984, is it not?
Yes, I mean, of course, it's not just the microphones with the audio and looking at the video, for example, with those things, but it's also all the electronic backgrounds that goes with it. Anything you're carrying with you, like a cell phone or any kind of transaction used with any kind of document, like your credit card transactions and all those kinds of things are all assembled, and that all becomes a profile, basically, of you. And by the way, they keep saying, well, we don't build profiles of people. No, they don't. The software does that. I mean, once you put the data in the base, it builds relationships, and that, in fact, is the profile. So anytime they want to look at you, all they have to do is point at you and say, give me his profile, and you get it. So it's not a matter of them not having it. They have the profile on everybody. And it's not done by people. That's another word game they play. They play all kinds of word games with people. You know, it's like we don't consider anything collected unless a person looks at it. Well, that doesn't stop them from collecting everything about everybody in the country. And that's what they're doing. And they're doing it through a program called Fairview, which is the main input program they have. If you go on the web and do a Google on Fairview, and NSA, you'll get the slides that'll show you there's like 80 to 100 tap points inside the continental United States, the lower 48 states, that show where they're tapping and collecting information off the fiber optic network.
And that was being put in, from what I was told and shown by engineers and later confirmed, at the telecom hubs all over the country at taxpayer expense, whole floors and whole rooms of cable companies, of AT&T, you name it, with all the data passing through it. Just outrageous. And then Bush walking around on TV in 2006 saying, oh, we don't listen to anybody in America, and playing the word game that the computers do when they can go open your profile up and see the whole menu of everything you do laid out, what movies you see, what books you read, all your emails. Google admits they open your emails and read it. Sir, what do you make of Amazon and Google and Microsoft and Apple and all of their admissions that they are data mining and using and selling the data? I mean, it's not just the NSA.
Well, I mean, I look at that also as the same as it's not as bad as the government, because they can't come arrest you or do violent things to you. But I mean, it's still a fundamental violation of privacy rights of individuals. I mean, and that's against, I believe, the Electronic Privacy Acts, Electronic Security Acts, and all that stuff that all were existing laws to try to give privacy to people in their electronic age. So, I mean, it's fundamentally, I don't think they should be allowed or permitted to do that either.
I totally agree with you. And expanding on that, what do you make of Kate Upton and all these stars with sex tapes and naked photos that they thought it was safe to send sex videos around or naked photos on an Apple cloud? What do you make of this whole cloud revolution?
Well, it's just it's just another means of accessing more data about individuals. I mean, anybody who puts information out there should assume that it's being scarfed up by the NSA. And then made available to the FBI and DEA and other government agencies.
Are our courts fundamentally now completely bankrupt if for a decade they've been or more creating fake cases with data they stole and then they lie and perjure to the court? I mean, that sounds like most of these convictions should be overturned.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and even the Solicitor General had to lie to the Supreme Court to get the case, Amnesty International versus Clapper thrown out. And that was, again, challenging the issue of NSA collecting all this data without a warrant. And the Solicitor General lied to the court, saying that anybody where this data was used against them, either in a court or wherever, they would be told. And that was simply a lie. And so now they're trying to scramble to figure out what to do about that. All the past thousands of cases that they've done this way, I think they're going to write those off and say, well, that's just collateral damage. Well, that shouldn't be. I mean, it's a violation of the Constitution, the foundation of this country. If our government wants to do that, they want to violate our Constitution or change it, there's a process to do that, and they should follow that process. Create an amendment, get it past Congress, send it around to the states to ratify. I mean, that's the procedure we're supposed to do. But our government is taking a totally different, very, very ugly path.
A totalitarian revolution is really what it is. William Edward Binney is our guest. I'm going to come back and ask him about that famous statement of Clapper, the director of intelligence, to Congress, saying, we don't spy on Americans, we don't collect any data. That's like saying the sun didn't come up. I mean, it's just, they're bad guys. I mean, that's what they are. They're villains. It's not being done to protect us. Exposefacts.org, William Binney. I've been on air 20 years. It'll be 20 years in about a month. And by 1996, as a libertarian promoting liberty, I had police chiefs contacting me in major cities, emergency managers, engineers, who were aware of all this stuff going into place behind the scenes. And I would go on air and talk about it, so I would get sent more data. Then I got syndicated. That's the reason I realized how much trouble we were in before a lot of other folks, was because a lot of people out there in the system who knew more than I did were basically using me as a conduit to get stuff out to the public. So I can't take credit for being light years ahead of everybody else. But now we don't have an excuse. This stuff is out in the open thanks to heroes like William Edward Binney, who could make a lot of money working for the private contractors and the big companies that are making tens of billions of dollars a year milking this. 800,000 people, the Washington Post reported last year, 840-something thousand, have access to all this spy data. And I'm no engineer, but I am a geopolitical researcher. It just sounds like insider trading, people harassing friends and family. It sounds like a way to corner markets. It sounds like a way for real terrorists or criminals to know if the good guys are after them. It just sounds like a devil's workshop on steroids with a helping of PCP to have 800,000 contractors in this. And now we know the NSA has used this stuff in other agencies. Because remember, this is given to dozens of other agencies, federal and state, to then just go out and harass their wives, their husbands, their neighbors, their competition, to plant stuff under sneak and peek and the Patriot Act on computers. I mean, it's just a Pandora's box of making us insecure and destroying our free market. Again, I'm not some 200 IQ super brain like William Binney, who headed up their major technical department and director of technical intelligence. I mean, that's the actual, to use a Starship Trooper analogy, brain bug. Okay, but just at my gut level gestalt, sir, did I hit on anything that is important, what I just said?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point is that this is drifting toward a government, a central government that's like J. Edgar Hoover on super steroids. They have the knowledge and background of virtually everybody in the country, and that gives them a basis for blackmail and influence peddling. So that's the way they can get things done, leverage against individuals and make sure that, like, for example, when Nancy Pelosi said impeaching George Bush is off the table, the leverage he had was she was a part of these programs, so she'd have to impeach herself.
So they get everybody to be part of it, including local police, and now they're all part of the cult.
Exactly, and now they all have to defend themselves. Otherwise, they all fall.
That's how Julius Caesar took over Rome. I mean, this has been Sir, is this not an orchestrated, diabolical plan, then?
It sure seems that way. At least it's being done, and the administrations as they come in keep perpetuating it. Well, I mean, from Russ Tice, who was a former also an NSA whistleblower, he has been saying that for a long time that they've been transcribing phone calls and conversations and emails of U.S. representatives and senators and and judges in the federal courts as well as the Supreme Court.
Well, that's now come out. The CIA is spying on the Senate.
Yep, and that's just CIA. NSA is much more powerful at that. So that just means that they're assembling all that blackmail information for leverage.
Gosh, and correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't having 800,000 contractors, just contractors, hooked into this, I mean, if I wanted to bring down a government or a country, I would let 800,000 people have access to this panopticon type system, because it would then leak everywhere, and then the country would be insecure. I mean, this sounds like the opposite of what I would want to do if I wanted to have a secure, safe country.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I mean, I objected to this in the late 90s when they first started doing this outsourcing to contractors. I was objecting to it then because I didn't think it was a smart idea to do that, just under the principle of exporting, giving away your trade secrets as a business to companies. And that's fundamentally what it is. It's you're giving away the trade secrets, how you acquire data, how you look at data, that kind of thing. And that's exposed to all these contractors.
And imagine how easy it is for foreign states and foreign corporations to then penetrate and compromise the contractors.
Yeah, that's right. That's happened any number of times down through history. I mean, that is a kind of a weakness that, they could even hire the contractors too. Later on, after their contracts were done with NSA, they could hire them as contractors over their way too. Although, they do have a non-disclosure agreement that says they won't disclose anything they've discussed. I mean, they take with them the knowledge of what they experienced while they were there, and they can apply that knowledge and techniques to other things without actually compromising what they were doing in NSA.
Incredible.
But effectively, it means the same thing. I mean, you're still giving that expertise away.
It's amazing to get your insight here on air. William Binney is our guest. I want to go to some phone calls, 800-259-9231, specifically questions for the highest level NSA whistleblower of all time. He was in the top 4 position there. Some say even the number 3 position, the director, the technical leader for intelligence with the NSA. I have a whole bunch of Twitter questions from Real Alex Jones here for you, sir. But first off, anything else you'd like to add before we go to these calls?
I just think we as a country and we as a people need to decide whether or not we're going to continue to tolerate this. I don't think we should. I mean, this is not consistent with our founding principles. We need to make this a major issue in the upcoming election in November. And when the politicians come around to solicit your votes and talk to you and all, you should raise these issues with them and say, look, if you don't start facing up and starting to live and protect and defend the Constitution, we are going to fire you. And we need to pass that message to them very strongly. Otherwise, they're going to sit there and drift along and do whatever they want to do. You have to threaten them with their jobs. That's the only thing that will make them do anything. That's what I think we need to do. I mean, I don't see any other way out of this.
Sure. I totally agree with your statement there. R.C. Patterson asked on Twitter, he says, Mr. Binney, any advice on how to mess or scramble the profile data with NSA is doing on us, i.e. web credit, purchase, etc.? I would just say everyone always thinks about how to get around it. How about we politically change it and stop the whole thing that's wrong? But until we get there, what would you do to protect your private information?
Actually, I do absolutely nothing. And the reason is because there's I'm a target, and so there's virtually nothing I could do anyway. So anything they wanted to get from me, they could actively attack my computer to get it, or do other sneak and peek kind of invasions of my house, like the FBI normally does. They do sneak and peeks to implant things in the house to listen to you and all that kind of stuff. So I know I'm a target, so therefore I don't really try to do anything at all. In fact, I don't want to, because I want them to know everything I'm saying about them.
I'm the same way. I have the exact same policy.
Yeah. Well, so I really don't know what anybody could individually do. I mean, I wouldn't. As long as you don't become visible to them for some reason or other, they won't target you. I don't think they'll look at your profile. But if you do something that irritates them, why, they'll call up your profile and start looking at you, though. So I don't, and I'm not sure really. I mean, you could try to use Tor. Tor is an annoyance to them. It helps anonymize what you're doing on the web. That is some impediment. It causes them some difficulty. If they target you, of course, they can go around that. So
one way to do it is jamming it with disinformation, garbage, just creating totally random profiles, just doing weird things. That'll create kind of plaques of clouds that will, I think, alter the profile. But I'd say look, it's criminal, it's illegal, and have the profile full of stuff exposing them so they're aware with their sample rate just how many people are awake to them.
Yeah, that's what I try to do. I make sure anything I say, if I refer to them, I refer to them in a way that makes it perfectly clear what I think of them.
Well, it's organized crime in a revolution against our civilization. I mean, do you agree with that statement? They have organized in a racketeering operation to openly violate everyone's rights en masse, lie about it, get caught, and keep lying.
Well, that certainly is an analogy that would work. I mean, I don't think they've taken the final step, like they haven't done what the Stasi does, like incarcerate you, but they discredit you and kind of try to embarrass you and get you out of the way. They just don't put you in the gulag or something, you know. That step has not been taken yet.
Well,
I mean,
they're starting to try.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it can't be.
Absolutely. Look at Dinesh D'Souza and his film.
Yeah.
Let's go to a phone call. Again, William Binney, who is a real hero, is our guest. Catherine has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I do. I have a question for Mr. Binney. I'm from Canada, which is not from USA, but like geopolitically speaking, I'm scared that Russia's gonna like trench over the border. There's no oceans. There's no nothing to stop them. What are we like? Should we be worried in Canada about Russia like marching over the Arctic?
Mr. Binney, you have had some things to say recently about the Russia situation. Russia is saying that they may take part of the Arctic that borders them. I don't see Russia in an offensive mode right now, but maybe you can correct me.
No, I don't. But this is also one of my I'm actually an NSA advocate. Okay, but I'm an advocate in the form of doing the right thing. Now, what's happened is when they went to this bulk acquisition of data that's diverted the effort and intensity and investigation into areas that aren't relevant to anything that's important, and that takes away from other areas like being able to watch the militaries of the Russians or any other country, and it reduces the capacity to do intelligence and to acquire and smartly assemble intelligence about those targets. So that's hurting our ability to understand what they're doing or what they're intending to do.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier, just as a layperson. When you're spying on 320 million Americans, how on earth could you be watching the Russians?
That's the point. But actually, it's even worse than that, though. It's probably on the order of somewhere between 3 and 4.5 billion people around the world.
Sure.
300+ million U.S. citizens, but the rest of the people in the world too. That's really the thing that's destroying the capacity. I mean, you need to have a rich environment of information that's relevant to assess something that's ongoing or that's impending. And if you don't have that, it becomes very difficult to succeed.
Which is what the globalists want. This is a sabotage plan against this country, in my view. Let's talk to David from Florida. Go ahead. You're on the air. Question for William Binney.
Hey, Mr. Binney, Mr. Jones, I really appreciate you immensely for your contributions to our society. I just wanted to mention that we've got Russia on the west, really intensifying in Archangel, where they put together a large part of their revenue to develop the largest world's oil platform to go into the Bering Sea and the Antarctic. And let's face it, the Antarctic has the largest troves of oil and gas, on the planet. And we've got to back up a little bit because we know that Hitler and the whole World War II was put together in a deal because it was all CIA-based, and we put all
I understand, but specifically, what is your question for the guest?
My question is this. We put together all of those Nazis into a place called Little America 4 in Antarctic. And I just want to know, what you think the outcome is going to be, because the end game, I think, is actually that the Russians, when the end game comes, they're going for Antarctica because...
Well, they said they're getting ready to go for it. I got to go because we have limited time. These are specific questions for Mr. Binney. You did join the intelligence professionals earlier last week, I know. I'm looking for the article, and basically came out and said that ex-NSA director, U.S. intelligence veterans write open letter to Merkel to avoid all-out Ukraine war. What is your take on Ukraine and Russia, sir?
It looks like the Russians are playing a saber-rattling game. It's not really an invasion. I mean, if you had an invasion like I was involved in analyzing all the invasion of Czechoslovakia and in Afghanistan, if you're preparing to have an invasion or you're going to have something, then you've got to be there with a lot, in the case of Ukraine anyway, with a lot more in terms of capabilities, in terms of personnel and equipment. I mean, you can't just do it with the few tens of thousands they have. So the point is, it's not really an invasion. What they're doing is playing games along the border and saber rattling. Now, the point is, I tend to agree with the president here that this needs to be solved diplomatically. And I believe that that's the correct route, rather than try to go to confrontation. I mean, I don't think the Russians feel very threatened by the expansion of NATO.
No kidding.
And I would say, well, okay, fine. If you look at it from their perspective, they have some concerns. Well, okay, why don't we invite them into NATO? Why don't we get all of us together in a mutual defense treaty?
Instead of always fighting with each other. Well,
instead of fighting with each other and looking and acting like they are really a threat, why don't we include them instead of excluding them?
Here's another question from Mike Headsroom on Twitter. He wants to ask you, Mr. Binney, has the NSA managed to break SSL? What is your preferred encryption algorithm?
I don't believe any commercially available encryption system is necessarily safe.
Of course, yeah.
Simply because of the back doors and the weakening that the NSA has done through a Bull Run program. That's been part of the Snowden exposure. They had the Bull Run program to weaken all the encryption systems. That simply meant they give them weaknesses in the keys or in the way keys are generated.
Well, don't they just pressure the developers to give them back doors?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And that's how they get it. And my point is that you can take some very simple, you could use whatever is commercially available as a kind of a community cipher that you could use. But underneath that, you have to come up with some variation of your own, so that when they go through assuming that they have the right keys and everything when they're breaking all these things, they end up with a mess.
Wow.
So that it's basically layers of complexity is what I'm and one of those layers can be a very simple thing, like you simply take the binary stream of a text that you're trying to encrypt and just transpose the bits in a pattern. And that destroys the integrity of the text. So that even if they have the correct key coming through the different layers of encryption for you, they still end up with that transposed mess, and they can't recognize it. So that's one way of that I had proposed of defeating bulk or the brute force attack on a system, just assuming a whole trillions of keys and going through keys and trying them to see if you get any partial text. Well, in that case, if you do that bit transposition, that destroys the integrity, so that any partial text you would get under any key assumption under that brute force attack would be absolutely wrong.
Amazing. Stay there. This is incredible. We have more questions straight ahead. How secure is Black Phone and more. Stay with us. All right, final segment in the full broadcast. Mr. Binney's agreed to do 5 more minutes with us into overdrive to finish these phone calls. Tyler, Lance, Melissa, C, Lee, and others that are holding. I got a bunch of questions that have come in at Real Alex Jones on Twitter, but look at this CNET News headline. Robot couch can drive you to the fridge and back, as if this country isn't already obese enough. Next, they're going to have toilets in the couch, like Idiocracy. People need to really wake up and stop just going along to get along. And just because the majority of folks want to be decadent slobs doesn't mean the rest of us have to be slaves to this. William Binney, top NSA whistleblower, is our guest. Truth, Justice, Liberty on Twitter, handle Occupy Earth Now, says, do you know anything about Israel having direct access to NSA data? I know some of the phone company caller ID systems do go back to Israel, and then that goes back to the infiltration via contractors by other governments. William Binney?
There are, of course, international relationships, and of course that's been published again by the Snowden material that they have relationships with Israel. But in general, any exchange of information between any of those parties is done separately. It's not. No one has free access to one another's databases. Those things are held kind of privately. If they want to share something, they put it off on a separate data set so that they can access that. So it's not. They don't have direct access.
Sure. We just saw the hack of the Apple Cloud. I wonder if there's been hacks of the CIA or NSA that we don't know about.
Well, supposedly they have a closed network. You know, that's what NSA claims they have, and I think for the most part they do. But you know, it's really, I mean, how many things are certain in this life? You know, that's the problem. They have very bad documentation of their network. In other words, one of the main things you have to do to ensure cybersecurity is you've got to have good documentation of your network. And that will tell you how people could access any of your components inside your system. And then you need to define what you want to protect, and then you surround and build within your system a protection system, you know, covering that. But those are two things that most NSA agencies in the U.S. government do not have. They don't have a good set of documentation on their network.
Sure. Plus, a lot of the
really
chips.
Don't know.
Sorry. Go ahead.
But I mean They have designed it that they wanted it closed. Now, whether it effectively is another question, okay?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Wow.
I can't really say for sure what is and what isn't there.
Tyler in California, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey there, gentlemen. I had a question for Mr. Binney, and obviously I have probably a million questions I could talk to him
It's fine. Go ahead and throw your question out.
Most important thing, but the anniversary coming up of 9/11, I think that we need to look into what's going on with the continuity of government. And I'd like to know Mr. Binney's opinion. If
Sure. What about coup d'etat by COG, kind of a reverse Valkyrie? We know that FEMA and others have basically set up their own governing system in the name of COG, but then that can be used to have a coup against the people.
Well, I, of course, would certainly not hope that would never happen. I mean, you have to do, of course, you have to have ways and means of protecting yourself. That's for sure. I mean, and I believe that for example, the Congress has a police force that guards them, and which, in case of CIA, if they really wanted to do something that I don't think would be effectively an effective deterrent. But most of the people I know in CIA or any of these other organizations, at least the people at the working level, would never tolerate any kind of move like that. I mean, these people are really, most of them are very dedicated, honest, patriotic people. They would never do that.
Exactly.
Like that.
They're compartmentalized, though.
Yeah, it's the management of these agencies is a real problem.
Absolutely. How do we deal with that? We're going to come back in 1 minute in overdrive. William Binney.
You are listening
ExposeFacts.org is the whistleblower website with he and other hero whistleblowers.
Today.
William Binney, ExposeFacts.org. I began to get into iodine a few years ago because it was helping me and my family so much get healthy and detoxify. Most people know that iodine deficiency has been a crisis around the world. Iodine is key to so many of the body's functions, especially the thyroid. I discovered a product being developed by Dr. Group. You now know it as Survival Shield, true nascent iodine that your body can really absorb. Then, about a year ago, he said, listen, if you think this is powerful, I'm going to come out with rare earth, deep earth crystals. And the results that I personally have had have been life-changing. Nobody else has got iodine based on these pure crystals, ladies and gentlemen. This is innovating, and the best part is it helps fund Infowars.com, the radio show, the TV show, the whole media operation promoting true libertarian ideas. For a limited time, experience the ancient power of Survival Shield X2. Take advantage of this unprecedented 30% off Super Detox Special at InfoWarsLife.com.
Coast to coast,
direct from Austin. You're listening to the Alex Jones Broadcasting Network.
Big Brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
Very exciting talking to Mr. Binney. He might be able to write a book soon, and can't wait to have him on about that. William Binney's our guest. We're taking phone calls. Lance in Washington has a question. Go ahead very quickly, please.
Yes, Mr. Binney, thank you for being an info warrior for this planet. You're a true patriot. I was just wondering if the Obamacare and all the other agencies, do they actually know what their right hand is doing? The left and the right hand.
That's a good question. I mean, Obamacare admittedly surveils all your medical records, and it just seems like everything is some new data snoop.
Yes, I don't believe they have. It's not really. It's such a mess. I don't think they're really that coordinated. But I think they've certainly. They certainly are trying to do something, but I think it's, again, a matter of collecting information on individuals. That's really what their whole objective is. So, I just think they're not very competent individuals at doing this kind of activity. I really don't. I don't think they have the competence to do it.
End Prism on Twitter asks you this question. He says, is PRISM a weapon against the people of the United States? How is it a weapon? I would expand that question and simply say, is the NSA now basically operating as an enemy of freedom in this country in a corporate government management coup of the nation?
I would say they are fundamentally, if you look at it from a constitutional point, that's exactly what's happening.
All right, there's your answer. Let's go to Woody in Washington, one of the last callers for William Binney. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Mr. Binney, what's the extent of spying on our foreign leaders like Merkel? I know some news came out about that when Merkel was being spied on. And secondly, are you familiar with the program Main Corps that was instituted under the Reagan administration?
I'm sorry, could you say that program?
He wants to know about Main Corps.
Main Corps. No, I'm not familiar with that, but as a general rule, leadership is always a target. So the leadership of basically any country in the world is always a target. And I think as their security will tell them that they are a target and warn them to ensure that they're covered, and also provide the means to help them secure their communications.
I mean, they even had Bush take his own toilet around with him because foreign governments wanted to get that.
Yeah, sure. They want to know everything they possibly can. I mean, it's not unique to the United States. Every country, every government, every leader of the world is targeted.
All right, one last caller. Sorry to Melissa. We're going to C in Texas. You're on the air with William Binney.
Hey, Alex. Hey, William. Thanks for being there. Alex, by the way, I'm a really good friend of Pat's. Mr. Binney, do you feel it will ever get to a point where the fact that it's so easy for people to go in and manipulate data and possibly change up all sorts of facts on people's Facebook pages and social network sites, where it just becomes so obvious to everybody that there could be plausible deniability by those people that they're actually spying on to come forward and say things so they're not blackmailed anymore? It just seems to me that they're reaching a point of, a critical mass, and where their hubris is almost their Achilles heel.
That is really an excellent question. We know they're using these systems to plant things. Won't that call into question the entire court system, you name it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what they did against us. They fabricated evidence from factual evidence that they had assembled about us. They fabricated a charge against us, and that's basically what the unfortunate part for them is that I caught them at it. That's the only reason I'm not in jail now, by the way.
You're just a hero. I just keep saying that. You've got so much courage. I want to get you back up as soon as you can to tell your story, sir. You just tirelessly are out there working for all of us, traveling the country at your own expense. I just can't wait till you get a book out. God bless you, William Binney. I'll say bye to you during the break. Just amazing.
Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government. You still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? Does anybody else see a problem here? If the government has nothing to hide, why are they so afraid to answer a few questions? This story does not add up. Listen to me. Listen to your head. Don't listen to anything they say.
Surely you have the creative ability to create a life without going through this friggin' sausage machine. Come on, we can do this. We don't need the bloody system. Perception control. This is a major thing that's going on. They're creating an electromagnetic sub-reality to talk to us within the frequency of human brainwave and electromagnetic activity. And this is what these are about. First of all, America, Britain, anyone else listening, we need a massive no-compliance rebellion against these frickin' things. Watch the word smart. Big red alert. Smart is the buzzword of Agenda 21. It talks about smart meters, smart grids, smart cities, human settlement zones, smart growth, smart drugs, smart frickin' arse. That's when he's talking about smart Agenda 21. And what is this bloody old thing? This is in their own bloody documents, not bloody, sitting in a darkened room working this out, bloody telling you. This is a plan to create eventually a global smart grid. And what the smart meters are, as part of the smart grid, they create, in effect, a electromagnetic internet, wireless internet, in your home. Very, very bad for health, especially the young. And also, it's about not only picking up information from your home and delivering that information to a central source, but also bringing information into your home within the human brainwave and electromagnetic frequencies to speak to you subconsciously and deliver you with the perceptions that they want. Let's look at this. This is CIA Director David Petraeus in a speech he made or a talk he talked about the Internet of Things. This is what he said. Items of interest will be located, identified, monitored and remotely controlled through technologies such as radio frequency identification, microchips, sensor networks, tiny embedded servers and energy harvesters, all connected to the next generation of internet using abundant, low-cost and high-power computing that would transform the art of spying and allow people to be monitored and automatically without planting bugs or direct infiltration. He said that this involved new technologies which added processors and web connections to previously home appliances like fridges, ovens, lighting systems. Remember that for a second. This is known as the Internet of Things. Petraeus has confirmed that people would be watched through televisions. These are Orwell's screens. So the idea of the smart meters is to create this energetic environment, this information environment, which is delivering information about you to the authorities and delivering information from the authorities at the subconscious level to speak to you. The smart grid is watching you. And the idea then is to connect these grids in different countries into a global grid. They talk about it in their documents. And, you know, on just the health dangers alone, especially to children, this is the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. The board of AAEM opposes the installation of smart meters in homes and schools based on scientific assessment of the current medical literature, which raises credible questions about genetic and cellular effects, hormonal effects, male fertility, yes, blood-brain barrier damage, and increased risk of certain types of cancers from RF or ELF levels similar to those emitted from smart meters. The board finds it unacceptable from a public health standpoint to implement this technology until these serious medical concerns are resolved. We consider a moratorium of installation of wireless smart meters to be an issue of the highest importance. Ignored because why? It's the agenda for Agenda 21. This lady thought she'd go green. She doesn't have to quite yet, but they wanted to very shortly in America, with these green anything but bulbs. Which are now being imposed upon us in Europe, of course, and other places around the world. And she thought she'd buy some of these things, these bulbs that got mercury in them. And she put one in her daughter's bedroom. And it broke. So she called Home Depot and asked them what she should do. And they said, well, you better call the state authorities and they'll tell you. And they told her she had to employ this private company to come and clean up her daughter's bedroom of this contamination from mercury. And it cost her $2,000 for one light bulb. And if you look at the British health advice and regulations for these things when they break, it's do everything but evacuate your bloody home. It is ludicrous. These mercury bulbs are going to go and are going onto, you know, open bloody rubbish sites and tips, and they're going to break, of course they are, and the mercury's going to get in the groundwater supplies and all that stuff. And we're talking billions and billions that are used around the world. And the other thing about this, you know what that is? That is a transmitter of information. That's what that is, and I'll tell you what I mean. Red flag when any authority doesn't say, we encourage you to use these, but says, no, no, you are going to use these because we're going to ban the bloody alternative. That's what they've done with these bulbs. And when they do that, it's the agenda. And when it's the agenda, it is more than what seems to be the case, and it's always about human control and often increasingly destroying human health. The woodpecker signal came about, I think it was in the 1970s, came to light. And it was a signal that the Soviet Union was broadcasting into America, and they called it the woodpecker signal because it was going rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, like a woodpecker. And what it was doing was delivering subliminal information into America to affect the perceptions of Americans. And these two guys, Dr. Robert Beck, an expert in nuclear engineering, and Dr. Michael Pessinger of the Laurentian University in Canada, an expert in extremely low-frequency radiation. They made a study of the potential of electromagnetic mind control. This is what the smart meters are, electromagnetic mind control. Dr. Beck told a Psychotronics Association conference in 1979, that long ago, that human subjects exposed to certain ELF field patterns reported sensations of uneasiness, depression, and foreboding. He said that he had measured the Russian woodpecker signal and found that it was acting like gangbusters right in the window of human psychoactivity. Exactly. Get in there by going on the same frequency the bloody brain works on. Now, here's the point. He said the signal was, the woodpecker signal was permeating power grids in the United States. It was being picked up by power lines, re-radiated, and it was coming into homes on the light circuits. Now, that was doing that in a light circuit electrical system that was not purpose-built for the job. The smart meters and the smart grids are purpose-built deliverers of subliminal information into every home and business that is involved in them. If we don't say no to this, then might as well put our bloody hands out and get the shackles on. Come on, enough.
James in North Carolina, you want to talk about 2012. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, it's good to talk to you again, Alex. It's been a couple months. And I'd also called in reference to the information you guys were putting out in regards to the Colorado case. You may recall I called in a little while ago, actually, and gave you some information on a DARPA program called Crossing the Threshold. We talked about actually the thought barrier being broken by DARPA and using light particles to actually be able to do it and manipulate people and take over using mind control. Oh, well, there are, yeah, I mean, as Dr. Begich says, a prestigious scientist, the chemical stuff is old. That's 1940s, 50s Soviet technology, stolen by the CIA and perfected to a higher level. Not quite perfected, but brought close to it. With the brain chips and things, it's total. I mean, 30 years ago, they had roaches that were remote control. 20 years ago, they had robo-rats that were remote control. Yeah, they can put brain chips in and have you do whatever you're told. Yeah, well, actually, it even goes a step beyond that now. The ability they have is actually using light particles and light beams. They can actually achieve thought profiling and transfer into any language. No, I know, because the brain program works in a flicker rate, and then they can now transmit data through the eyes directly to the brain. That's why they're in government buildings putting in the lights that, quote, communicate with the computers at a flash rate that can't be perceived consciously. And then I went and found the patents now, Dr. Begich on, it's actually programmers. They're actually programming now under federal grants, mainly in police departments, to test and see if they can put police under mind control. Yes, sir, and I had actually spoke with you on this previously, and work in the insurance industry, and actually have had some information sent over from a company that's participating in this. They gave some information out and said basically that we're going to be able to communicate with animals. They can do all this stuff, you know, simultaneously while, you know, achieving thought profiling of people without them knowing. No, I know. It's actually, you're saying that this is, why don't you send over anything that isn't proprietary or classified? I know you're in insurance, so it's not. Send it on over. We're media. Send it to showtips@infowars.com. But I am aware of all this, and I am aware of its deployment all over. I mean, that's why the elite are so arrogant right now. The public is already in a trance. Some people are resistant or immune to this, and that's why we're still able to operate. I mean, that's why, folks, it's so far gone. I mean, that's why celebrity doesn't matter. Attacks on me don't matter. None of it, once you know reality, none of this facade even matters anymore. And they haven't perfected all this stuff. They're testing it on us right now. And I just want to say to all the minions of this system, if you want your free will and consciousness taken, don't fight this. Because they're just going to try to get us in a catatonic state to then release the bioweapons to reduce our numbers over 90%. Anything else, sir? Yes. Right now, it's on basically like a one-on-one type of basis. The people they use to thought profile can only do it. They can't do it on a mass scale yet. So, I mean, like you were just saying before, it gets to the point where they can actually, you know, systematically put something in place or a computer program, you know, where it can do it on a mass scale. I mean, this is a time where... Well, I mean, take San Antonio. It's a test ground. You've heard for 3 years how the Pentagon put AI cameras in to track the calories, to even scan an apple when a child eats it and then put it in a file. What's really going on is they've put those light bulbs in that San Antonio school. I have that from inside the school. The first one they did it, and the computers are actually testing the children under the fluorescent lights. It's so far gone, folks. We're so far gone. I have been inside major universities. I've had scientists on. I've broken it down. So much of the focus by the globalist is on flicker rates with lights. And now they can interface and transmit data directly to the brain. In fact, I mean, it was in mainstream news, 2 weeks ago, that scientists use light patterns to program brain. And I mean, so, but they're now announcing what's old. The point is, just like you have a cell phone and it listens to you even when it's off, and they admit the NSA now does that. I told you 16 years ago. They now admit it just in the last few years. They tell you way after they think that you've habitualized its use, that you have a total habit and will accept it.
It's all animal training. It's all domestication. And everything is how to program you with these lights. And it's just insane. Now they have data over power lines, and the smart meters can program through the energy, through regular fluorescent light bulbs, and program your mind, put you into a state. And it's all patented. It's all on record. It works. I remember like 14 years ago, I had the CEO of a company. It's now been put in Japan and other areas. In the U.S., it freaked people out too much. The Japanese actually have adopted it, where Coke machines, soft drink machines, beam a audio, but you can't hear it in your ear. It resonates in your skull directly through, telling you want to drink the drink. Now they face scan with Facebook in Japan. They're also testing this in New York City, where it knows you when you walk by, beams audio and says, don't you want a Pepsi? Don't you want a Coke? Or don't you want something out of this vending machine, John Doe? Now, you saw that Minority Report, what, a decade ago? Because, folks, it isn't Minority Report. Philip K. Dick was in with some very powerful researchers in San Francisco. And I've had a chance to talk to people connected to the Philip K. Dick estate. I'll just leave it at that. And, in fact, they may even be at liberty to come on after the show, I didn't call any of those people I told you to make me call yesterday. Make me call those people, as I got stuck in other meetings, because I want to try to get the Philip K. Dick daughters on. I'll just say it. And I want to try to get, because obviously I was in Scanner Darkly and consulted on that with Keanu Reeves and others, Woody Harrelson and others, and they authorized the rights for that Philip K. Dick to be turned into a movie. So that's how and I have a connection through Tommy Pilato, the producer. I need to get Tommy on because Tommy knows a lot too, but I don't know what the point is, folks. He wrote that stuff in the 70s. Okay? We're not in Kansas anymore. All this stuff was envisioned a long time ago. We're living in a plan. The globalists are 30 years at least ahead of us. And I just want to communicate with the globalists and say, you're not, this old plan is dynamic. It's amazing you've been able to do this, but you're so cold-blooded, you think that's your strength, it's your weakness. And you're going to end up destroying yourself. You can't do this to the species and not have it come back on you. And I know a lot of you are turned over to pure evil, but some of your children and people who are now middle-aged who aren't pure evil, and others, because I've talked to you, including some European heads of state, and you're having second thoughts about this. You don't want to do this. You don't want to do this. But I'm on two paths here, trying to convince you this is not a good path and trying to wake up whoever's not in a full trance right now.
The system that we're talking about is going to be the HAARP system, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project, operating up here in Alaska. And if you also think about, and most people remember this from even high school science, but the magnetic field lines that come from the South Pole stretching around and then intersecting at the North Pole and surrounding the planet. These magnetic field lines are very much similar to what you would see on a bar magnet illustration in your basic science books, or in a motor, if you think about the Earth spinning and actually creating a dynamo, a motor, and these magnetic field lines being one of the outproducts of that, in conjunction with interaction with the solar wind, you get things like the magnetosphere and the magnetotail, which comes back behind sort of the way the downwind of the planet, if you will, from the sun itself. In any case, this dynamic of the Earth's motion, solar radiation, the interplay of all of the various factors of the planet are looked at in separate, independent, individual science, not really looked at in integrated science. How do all those systems work together, and what do they create in outcomes? But as we look at HAARP, the primary idea is to affect this ionosphere and then affect these magnetic field lines. And ideally, you want to affect those magnetic field lines and the closest place to which they intersect the planet, which happens to be at the poles. And in the case of where Alaska sits on a map, very near the poles, the furthest northern territory in the United States, where you could locate a facility on U.S. territory that you could inject energy directly into the magnetic field lines of the Earth. We're going to be talking about an area above the Earth's surface, about 30 miles above the Earth's surface, moving out several hundred miles beyond that, the ionosphere. It's a highly charged area. It filters out cosmic radiation, various particle streams that without it would make life impossible on the planet. Now, one of the ideas behind HAARP, which is an array or field of antenna here in Alaska, 180 antenna in the array today, it fires or concentrates, focuses radio frequency energy that it literally sends up into a relatively narrow beam affecting the magnetic field lines in one instance where the energy is normally, naturally flowing from the South Pole, coming up, arcing high above the equator, then coming back into the North Pole, with the energy flowing from south to north. What happens is those magnetic field lines act as waveguides, so you can pump energy out of HAARP, focus it on those magnetic field lines, and then it screws itself, if you were to be able to see it, with like a corkscrewing motion where the energy is actually moving now from north to south using the magnetic field lines as a waveguide. Now what would that do, essentially? If you had, for instance, an intercontinental ballistic missile that gets fired from China to the U.S. and it traverses those magnetic field lines with those charged particles racing along them, using them as waveguides, it would create a virtual shield around the planet, so any of those incoming objects, intercontinental ballistic missiles, any satellites that happen to traverse those areas, or any other electronically sensitive equipment would be destroyed almost instantly. And so when you think about HAARP, there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is manipulation of those field lines, those magnetic field lines, which actually have been mapped. And if you look at some of the ways those are mapped is barium particles are injected into the upper atmosphere and lower ionosphere using barium-laden rockets. What those create when you inject radio frequency energy is air glow, where you get this sort of light-up effect. So you can actually see this corkscrewing motion around those magnetic field lines and serving as waveguides. In fact, they did that test a number of years ago in Alaska. And they do these from time to time, just more or less illustrate what they think theoretically should happen is actually happening in place and at the time of the experiments. Now, HAARP as an array of antenna can be focused and concentrated. You've got to think about this in a much different way than normally how radio frequency energy behaves. If you think about a radio broadcast antenna, broadcasting radio frequency energy, that energy dissipates or spreads out very rapidly from the point of broadcast, the antenna, out into the atmosphere. And the further away you get, the less dense, the less concentrated is that radio frequency energy, which is why radio stations eventually fade out over distance. On the other hand, what HAARP does is by firing this array or field of antennas, you imagine firing them in such a way as to create kind of a corkscrewing motion, a cyclotron resonance is what it's called, where that energy is then focused to a smaller and smaller area, and as it hits the ionosphere, it becomes concentrated. And think about that in the same way as light coming off of a laser versus light coming off of a flashlight. When you think about HAARP, think about it as a mechanism on the ground that's designed to interact directly or to plug into those magnetic field lines and actually then use the environment itself as part of the machine on the ground. And think about it in this sense. Think about that machine on the ground, this field of antenna broadcasting radio frequency as a primer, the small amount of energy, because the big energy is contained in the natural environment. The idea is if we understand enough about how these mechanisms work, then we can trigger various cascading effects where it sort of builds on the energy that's naturally in place. And so when you think about HAARP, not just in the effect of magnetic field lines, but another opportunity to manipulate energetic systems within the Earth has to do with the ionosphere itself. And imagine that ionosphere is a bubble around the Earth, several hundred miles thick, again starting about 30 miles off the Earth's surface. Now, That's a highly charged area, a tremendous amount of energy potential there. In fact, some will remember a number of years ago, there was a shuttle experiment where they drug a tether, a dangling wire, through the ionosphere to see what would happen. And energy was picked up as it moved, because when you move something, a conductor, through an electric field that's as charged as the ionosphere, it actually begins to move current, which it did. It shunted that current straight into the shuttle and almost blew it out of the sky. Now, the thing that came out of that didn't get widely talked about was the amount of energy produced could be useful, for instance, for keeping a low orbiting space platform in orbit around the planet, being able to charge it up by just tapping the energy by the fact that it's orbiting the planet and moving through the ionosphere would be one way to charge up these kinds of space-based platforms, whether they were for weapon systems or running low orbiting satellites. But basically moving energy into space in normal, like shuttle payloads, is prohibitively expensive, very difficult to pull off to any great degree. But if you could create an energy source sufficient to run these kinds of systems, then you eliminate all kinds of logistical problems, and you're able to keep these things aloft for great deals of time. Part of the HARP idea was if you could focus radio frequency energy, you could even concentrate it and send energy directly to these same kind of low orbiting space platforms, as an example. One of the other thoughts with HARP systems are the actual heating of the ionosphere. And when it's heated, because this energy is concentrated, what happens is the ionosphere then lifts up, moves out several hundred kilometers. Now imagine if you're a satellite drifting through space where there's no atmosphere, and all of a sudden you hit a column of atmosphere. What will happen is it creates friction, and that friction causes that satellite to burn up, and all of a sudden you got a satellite down. When you turn the instrument off, everything goes back to normal, and you have plausible deniability on a satellite going down because nobody knows this kind of technology generally exists. Now, the other place you can use it in that same application, imagine that column going out several hundred miles into space from its normal atmospheric level way down here. Now you've got an incoming comet or asteroid coming in from outer space at a tremendous velocity. Now normally those objects, when they hit our atmosphere, they again encounter tremendous friction, they burn up, and most objects dissipate before they ever hit the surface. But big objects, the kinds of objects people are worried about, if you could, say, go from 30 miles of atmosphere to 200 miles of atmosphere, almost 7 times as much distance, and project a trajectory downward, what you're able to do in that instance is literally allow those larger objects to burn up way before they hit the Earth. In fact, the Strategic Studies Institute in London, in reviewing Soviet research on this very same technology, was suggesting that it could be used for not an anti-satellite technology so much as an anti-asteroid or comet-based technology. But all of those things also create a side effect. When you move that much atmosphere up into space, and it's about 30 miles diameter, these columns, so imagine 30 miles in diameter and a couple hundred miles up. Well, below that are pressure systems, high pressure, low pressure systems, and jet streams, all of which can be altered by the manipulation of the ionosphere in this way. And that then creates downstream weather effects that cannot be modeled, that cannot accurately be predicted, and therein lies huge problems. When you start to manipulate by technology applications to create one effect, you might inadvertently create a number of other effects, as is the case with HARP. Looking at sort of where are these facilities? You know, here in Alaska, we have one at Gokana, which is about 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. Then going across Canada, there's a number of these facilities that are controlled by the Canadian government. Rosalie Bertel has reported on those. Then there is one that sits right up here in northern Norway, and this is run by the Max Planck Institute. And then there are 5 old transmitters in the former Soviet Union. Literally, when you look, they go around the globe. These can be used in conjunction with each other, triangulating to hit the same point, creating unique and different resonance effects and creating even more power. Flipping the planet upside down In Antarctica, China put in a facility a couple years ago to begin working in this technology. And then Arecibo, Puerto Rico, in the southeastern, off the coast in the southeastern United States, also has a facility that's been retrofitted to essentially do the same thing as HAARP. Ionospheric heaters, which are what these were previously called, actually originated in the former Soviet Union. People remember them from the 1970s when they created what was called the woodpecker signal, and it was exactly as it sounded. It was this weird static that was rhythmic and coherent, man-made. Ham operators picked it up all over the world, and because they could triangulate where it was coming from, they isolated the location of these 5 transmitters in Russia, or the former Soviet Union. And those transmitters were associated with health effects in Oregon, power failures in central Canada, and a number of other anomalous phenomena in the 1970s. And those were the predecessors of HAARP. It's the very same technology with a modern twist. The old transmitters would take 15 minutes to reset the frequency because you had to readjust all these antennae. Now, with HAARP, it's done in milliseconds by adjusting the software. So, very efficient. You can change things. You can cause them to do different things. It's not a big project in terms of reset. And it's a small expenditure. I mean, HAARP they've spent $100 million on, which in military terms is like cab fare. You know, it's like it's not even cab fare. It's the snowflake and the pile of snow out front that we walk through in the course of all this. But when you look at the impact of each of these technologies that we've touched on today, it's not the same game anymore. These are earth-shaking technologies, the very technologies that will either transform or enslave. Most science, at least in the U.S., is developed, most of the high science anyway, is developed through military research labs, military contracts, and some contracts to the National Science Foundation. But all of the military work and much of the work done by the National Science Foundation and others represent compartmentalization, separation of the sciences in small bits and pieces, so basically one side doesn't know what the other is doing. In fact, the first paper I ever presented at 19 was on the contrasting sort of our approach of compartmentalization in our approach to science and the Russian approach, or the Soviet approach at that time, which was to use generalists, to take people from all disciplines, integrate them into the same room so that you could develop the higher ordered thinking, because then you brought all of these various disciplines, even when they didn't seem to fit, you brought them together and they tended to feed off of each other in a way that built better and more comprehensive science. In fact, as it relates to electromagnetic exposures, the science developed in the Soviet Union said, and they set the regulations, not that they enforced them, but they at least had them on the books, they were 1,000 times more stringent than the U.S. standards in the same areas because of that integrated approach. When you look at the productive capacity of the USSR during the Cold War, they couldn't produce their way, into an outhouse. It was a mess. But what they could do is compete on science. And the way they competed on science with us, and were able to not only excel in some areas, surpass us in others, and stay up with us in most, was by integrated science, as opposed to compartmentalization. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, and it yields usually better results. On the U.S. side, we do the opposite. We continue that model of compartmentalization to the detriment of really good science, and at a huge, huge economic cost. The duplication within that system, the cost of man-hours within that system, and the waste that's created in that system. Now, what does that all mean in the broader context of global science? The U.S. spends in the regular defense budget somewhere around $700 billion a year, which is a big number. We've got a couple wars going on top of that. The Chinese spend about 70, 80 billion is what our intelligence tells us. At least that's what's publicly released. When you run inefficient science, And the Chinese don't run inefficient science. They steal everything they can that's already been developed and then take it from there. And they do it at rice bowl wages. You know, they're not paying top flight scientists $250,000, $500,000 a year in salary and benefits. And they're not paying Davis-Bacon wage rates to build ships. They're building them for a bowl of rice. And what you get in China for $70 billion is what you get in the U.S. for probably far in excess of what we actually spend, because you can't measure it in dollars or currencies. You have to measure it in productive output. And what the Chinese are doing with their productive output is making sure that they can move millions of men and women in their armed services anywhere they want to put them on the planet. That's what's going on there. For every ship they build, we think about it because they actually build hardware and they build it faster than virtually anyone on the planet, and it's causing a lot of concern, because when you start to think about how does all this play into the geopolitics of the planet, climate change and energy and the issues that we've been talking about the last couple of days, they really do fit together. You know, China is moving to energy independence. They're building a coal to liquids plant every 18 months from start to finish. They have so many planned online. Their objective is to be free of the West in terms of contributions to basic natural resources. And what are they doing with all the trillions of debt, U.S. debt, that they're collecting? What are they doing with all the dollars that they're collecting? They're going around the world. They're outbidding Western companies by outbidding us on mining opportunities, the venture capital opportunities, the rare earths and mineral opportunities, and all those plays all over the world. They're outbidding everyone. And why are they doing it? Why would you want to hold a bunch of U.S. paper right now that you know is going to be dropping in value? You're better off buying the commodities. You know, when the market fell apart and copper hit $1.30 a pound, which was the lowest it had been in years, the Chinese bought more then than they ever bought in their history, and they bought it all the way up till it blew through the old record price by 10% while the economy is still in the toilet in the U.S. and Europe, and commodity prices are breaking through the roof. And all those investments those Chinese made with all those cheap U.S. dollars, well, they still had a little bit of value, and we all thought they were nuts for paying 10, 20% more than the market said those assets were worth. What a deal they made on all those commodities, not just what was already finished. And what does it mean, just copper alone? There's 8 days worth of copper in warehouses in the world to fulfill 8 days worth of global demand right now today. That's how underproducing we are in that specific commodity. Zinc, nickel are in similar situations where there's very limited supplies on hand. Rare earths, it's even worse, and all of those are controlled by China. When you start to think about earth-penetrating tomography as a technology for locating underground mineral resources, as an example, oil and gas resources. Some of that technology was tested, and it was tested in over 20 states on a number of wells that were drilled by Halliburton back in the 80s and into the 90s. And what they looked at was using a very simple method of earth-penetrating tomography. They were able to look and with absolute 99.9% accuracy, grade and quantity and quality of oil and gas layers through the earth, matching up perfectly against actual drill logs from when they physically drilled those wells using this type of technology. Now imagine, and remember what we were talking about earlier about the public owns energy resources in most instances. In Alaska, in all instances, are publicly owned. But if you could, with certainty, image the underground geologic structures and know exactly where oil and gas is, now you no longer have risk associated with the drilling activity, which is why everyone says, you know, we ought not to be in the energy business. But when you can define where those deposits are, then you can maximize or optimize what you get on the lease, because now everyone has good information. People want to bid on that lease competitively. You're going to optimize the public's return on those resources. So using our technology for doing some things maybe makes a lot of sense, but there's lots of ways to do earth-penetrating tomography and to identify those mineral resources, oil and gas resources. HARP is one of those technologies that perhaps we could use in this way. When Skylab launched the first time, we realized that, back in the 70s, we realized that it created a hole in the ozone layer. And everybody watched it, you know, and they said, oh, after a few hours it all filled in and everything went back to normal. But think about this now. I mean, think about it as a practical matter. The Earth is turning, you make a hole, everything's moving, eventually it gets filled in, or it appears to get filled in. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Think about if I dip a cup of water out of a pond, you know, and all the water levels back out. Did it fill back up? Well, if I keep dipping those cups of water out of that pond, eventually there is no pond. But it sure looks flat and level with just a couple dipped out. So what was it? You know, I thought Skylab creates an ozone hole. How many billions of cans of aerosol would have had to get up there? And it didn't start down here, you know. It started up there where you actually delivered particulate material to the place that you're trying to affect and created a chemical reaction. 3,000 satellite and rocket launches, over 3,000 worldwide, did more for the ozone depletion on the planet, I assure you, than all the air spray that everybody ever discharged. And again, nobody takes any responsibility. Blame it on the guy with the aerosol can. Well, governments stand back and go, we didn't do anything here. This is the problem and the arrogance of it all. And often it's the case where the other guy is blamed for something that our own government has done. In fact, if you look at environmental issues generally, you know, virtually all the Superfund sites, 90% of them, are government sites where the government made the mess, and then the rest of us get to clean it up. Now we're experimenting with science that's much, much different than leaving a mess in some local location on the ground. We're manipulating the entire geophysical systems of the planet and trying to learn how to do it better, how to dial it up a little more efficiently, how to control those outcomes with a more precision and a more higher resolution as our science advances. We've written the book Controlling the Human Mind, and we wrote and produced the video Mind Control, which Alex has carried for years. And I always consider that the most important work. Even when you associate some of the mind effects things with HAARP, they're big and they're important. But as we got more into that subject, it became, for me, the most compelling and important work that we've published. Because the idea of interfering with human consciousness, this idea of being able to interfere with free will, if you will, something that even God will not do in most religious traditions, interfere with free will, is now within the capability of man. Should man do it? I say absolutely not. Again, thinking about personal liberty and personal freedom, the basic premise of the First Amendment of the Constitution, the right of free speech, the right of assembly, the right of free expression of religion, all of those presuppose a fundamental right, the freedom to think. That's the First Amendment, because it presupposes all of that. Without the freedom to think, none of the other liberties matter at all. And this is the century that we're in. The CIA, actually the work in this goes before the CIA. You go back to the work at Harvard, work being done at the hypnotherapy labs at Harvard in the 1920s by a guy named Estabrook. And Estabrook had this idea that you could create what we would call today the Manchurian candidate, you know, some super spy that would be pre-programmed to do destruction or gather intelligence, and if captured would have absolutely no knowledge of any of it. Well, he started this work in the 20s. By the 1930s, his work was classified. By the 1960s, the material he had published, he acknowledged that he created these super spies, that he spent 9 to 10 months, and 1 out of 5 people were subject to this level of programming, where he would subject them to 9 to 10 months of programming where he literally split the personality into 2 separate human beings within the same body, programming one to be the super spy where they could function in another country without detection, and if captured would have no memory of their true self. And yet when they returned to the United States, this altered consciousness could be re-triggered to remember everything they collected in the foreign country and their true self. The problem is You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once you fracture a human being in this way, you've effectively destroyed them forever. He believed this was a good idea, and he advanced this technology. In the same material that he published advancing the idea that using LSD to alter people's consciousness for mind control experiments was legitimized and reasonable and a good thing. That's what he wrote in his published work. At the same time, the Central Intelligence Agency later was revealed to be experimenting with LSD on 8,000 men and women in the armed services alone, not to mention the civilian sector. This came out in a congressional report that was on activities within the CIA right after Watergate. When, remember Watergate, there's ex-CIA operatives breaking into this building for the bagmen of the Nixon administration. Well, there are no ex-CIA guys, number one, unless they're dead. And number two, the fact is when they got caught, what they got caught doing were mind control experiments. The church committees and the Congress actually heard the testimony as the CIA busied themselves shredding the documents, because they acknowledged over 140 programs under MK Ultra and its sub-programs that were directly involved in the manipulation of human behavior using chemical means and electromagnetic means. And one of the organizations they worked through at the time was the Mankind Research Association, operated out of Bethesda, Maryland, which was a front for Navy intelligence organizations and the Central Intelligence Organization, developing mind control technologies and an understanding of what those would be about. More than a Manchurian candidate, manipulating people over huge geographic areas for very specific outcomes. At the same time, they were engaged in a great deal of research on what they called paraphysics, or parapsychology, or ESP in those days. A number of those reports prepared as far as our analysis of Eastern Europe that were eventually released under Freedom of Information Act are posted on our website. And you can go and look there and you'll see hundreds of pages of these declassified documents. They're heavily redacted. I mean, lots blacked out, but you get a general sense of what we were doing. And here's what they discovered. And it's not in the published work. It's not in the other videos. It's not in that material. But here's the conclusions after all of it. And I met the Northwest field director, got to know him real well over the years, of the Mankind Research Association, the kind of stuff they were doing back in the 70s. And he kept his data. He's got a great box of data talking about all of these experimentations. And what they concluded was that A, extrasensory perceptions, these odd little things that people could do, were real. Not in all instances, but in enough instances to cause them some alarm, military planners. Because what also they discovered is that human beings generally have these innate capabilities that we used to call extrasensory perception. Some have referred to as gifts of the spirit. They come by a lot of different names. But what they are is natural attributes of what human beings are. We're created in the image of a creator. That means more than how we look. It has to do with what we are. And what we are very capable individuals. But in order to reach those higher capabilities, in order to reach those higher states of awareness, in order to actualize your full potential as a human being, you have to be able to slow the mind. You have to be able to create a situation where the mind, if you were to look at it with an EEG and look at the brain activity, you get very coherent, very rhythmic patterns, the kind associated with the emotions of love and empathy and compassion. Same kind of patterns show up. Higher ordered thinking is associated with these coherent patterns, these rhythmic patterns. Fear, flight responses, anger, hate, you get incoherent patterns all over the map at a higher amplitude, at a higher pulse rate, that indicate agitation, confusion, the inability to think. What we do know is that in states of fear, worry, and anxiety, you cannot ever reach your higher capacity as a human being. So the easiest mind control technique, keep people in a state of fear and worry and agitation, and we're defeated before the first volley is fired. That's not what we need to be about. You know, when you think about it, when you're walking confidently, consciously doing what you know you're capable of doing, how empowering it is to step into each act that you take on as a human being in a productive and meaningful way, without fear, without worry. It's when your mind falls into what some call that zone that the athlete knows and the artist knows, and every one of us knows in those instances where those sparks of creativity come through. That is our normal state of consciousness. If you were to look at it in the lower range of the alpha range where you are in that most creative mindset, you'd be between 7 and 8, 7 and 9 hertz pulses per second. The planet naturally oscillates at 7.83 hertz pulses per second. Isn't that interesting? Correlates perfectly with the ideal state for awake, conscious living when you're awake. And yet the fields that we surround ourselves with in this room right now, in every room where everyone's watching this because the power grid is operating at 60 hertz, 60 pulses per second, an agitating signal all the time in our background noise, if you will, our noise. Because think about it, in a crowded room, all the noise you hear and you're having a conversation with your friend, and you block out all that background noise. We do the same thing with electromagnetic fields. I'll tell you when you notice it. I couldn't use this analogy in Germany. I'll tell you why in a minute. But think about when the power fails in your community. When the power goes out, completely goes out, the power grid's down. Now everybody remembers it given all the winter storm activity. And the first thing you notice how quiet it is because the refrigerator's not humming along, the air conditioner or the heaters aren't blowing air around. The second thing you notice is how your whole body exhales as you relax. Same feeling when you come in from a hard day of work and you're wearing your insulated soles on your shoes, and the first thing you do is you kick them off and you come back into ground with the pulse rate of the planet and you relax. That relaxation is the silence. Do you know what the sound of being born into an explosion is? Silence. We're living in that explosion, in the fields that surround us every moment of every day. When I used that analogy this last year in Stuttgart, everybody looked at me like I was crazy when I said, you know, when the power fails. It never fails in Germany. People with gray hair never remember a power failure since World War II ended. You know, I mean, we don't even think about that. I mean, you talk about the contrast in technology. I can't even use the same analogy in Europe because it doesn't make sense because their technology happens to run smoother. And we invented the power grid for all practical purposes. But again, you know, I say it humorously, but at the same time recognizing under all this are these very real effects that we have to recognize. So how do you learn how to control you? You know, people ask me all the time, you know, you talk about a lot of technologies generate a lot of concern, some levels of anxiety. That's not my intention. My intention is to inform so we can begin to think about this stuff in a productive, constructive way and how we address it. But more importantly, the more important part of this message, and anything that I've said in the last couple of days, is about the fact that we are more than we think we are. There are no small things. There's only things that are undone. Each thing that we do as individuals matters. It matters a lot, more than you might even realize or recognize. And there are no small things. And what I do versus what you do, it's not a size issue. It's getting the work done. All of us have a sphere of influence, and we need to assert ourselves in that sphere of influence. What that means is it might mean that we have a conversation with our family or our close friends. We don't feel any anxiety having done that. When the anxiety creeps in, back off. Think about what you're doing. It should be like breathing if you're working outside of fear and outside of worry, and you're working in a way that is possible, where you acknowledge it's possible. Do what you know you can do to further your version and your view of the truth, and do it in a respectful way, and do it with confidence. And don't lift the burden if it's too heavy. There's someone else that'll lift it for you, or lift it with you. But do something in favor of what you believe to be right and true, whether it's on any of the issues we've covered today or on some other issue, but something that you care about and recognize there's a billion other people doing the same thing, and we're not waiting for an organization to form. We're already standing in it. It's called the human race. Participate in it. Be what you were created to be, and assert yourself in the world today by effecting change, by direct action, in a respectful and rational way, and without fear and without worry, because that is the zone in which things can happen. Fear is the adversary. It has always been the adversary, and it's the easiest method of controlling human behavior. When you think of the whole 1984 scenarios, which I think are here now, I mean, certainly are here now on steroids. I mean, those guys are rolling over in their grave because it's a lot worse than they thought. Huxley, you know, he wrote Brave New World, and the essay most people missed of his was one of the very last ones he wrote, which was Brave New World Revisited. When he went back and sort of looked at it and said, oh no, it's 40 years ahead of where I thought it was. Now, this is in the late 1950s, and I think he died in 62 or 63. So the very end of his life, and the things that are the most important to read aren't what somebody wrote early in their career, it's what they wrote at the end, sort of how they evaluate. You know, when I look at studying someone's work, I start with the last thing they wrote and work my way backwards, because there's the pinnacle of their knowledge. And Huxley's pinnacle of the knowledge was the last warning, the last shout in the movie theater saying, hey, it's 40 years ahead of the game, and it probably isn't going to be chemistry that does it. It's going to be something else. And it's the electronics of this century. It's the tools that we've been talking about misapplied to the population. Those are the things that are causing Huxley today to roll over in his grave, because even that warning was 40 years too old. I mean, that warning in the late 50s and his conclusion then was nothing compared to what has emerged in the 21st century and what came out of the last century. This technology to change not just our emotional states, but the way we perceive the world, already exists on the planet. New breakthroughs are being anticipated by military planners. This last year, 2010, DARPA let 2 contracts, University of California, for developing methods and means for creating electronic telepathy, where we can electronically transfer thoughts into the mind of another person in a way that they cannot distinguish the artificial from their own. Now think about that in the 21st century. If you can create a complete memory set, one of the stated goals of Air Force planners, to complete a complete memory set that you cannot distinguish the real from the fiction, is that the witness you want on your trial in the courts of the 21st century? The guy who can swear by that memory, and yet that memory is as false as a $3 bill. That's the technology of this century. It'll challenge the very institutions that we depend on for justice, for liberty, for freedom. Synthetic memory. It's being even played off in terms of Gulf War syndrome and in terms of the shock that people come out of the war with. You know, the shock, the fear, the memories, the post-traumatic stress syndrome that boils out of these war efforts. And so what are we hearing about? Ways to wipe the memory clean so people can forget all those bad experiences. Do they really go away, or do they just get driven deeper into the subconscious where they do their real work at breaking down the consciousness of a human being, where they can't get played out, they can't get worked out, they get suppressed, and suppressed conflicting ideas are the root to a lot of the psychosis we see in the world today. This is the solution of military planners. Wipe out the memory of the gladiator so they don't know what they did. And somehow that will excuse the behavior and save that person's soul. No, it won't. It'll mask the pain and let it break out in some weird, irrational way, because that's what happens when you suppress these kinds of memories. Secondly, maybe we want these guys to remember what they did, because maybe some of the things that they were directed to do they shouldn't have done in the first place. Maybe the memories that they have of the abuses that we inflict on others are memories that somebody ought to be testifying to someday, instead of bearing, because now we have a technology that can mask the behavior of our troops in combat. That's not the answer. In the past wars, the wars that our fathers fought and our grandfathers fought. When they returned from battle, the stench of death was still in their noses, and they worked hard to avoid wars and future wars, to save the next generation from experiencing the same trauma they did. Trauma is the outcome of war, but it also makes us, as human beings, resist war, make it our last effort, not our first effort. If we take it out, we make it neutral, where there's no pain, there's no residual memory. It becomes easier and easier to inflict war on others. It becomes easier and easier to use that as the solution rather than diplomacy and fair play. Is that what we want? Is that the reflection of American values we want our military, paranoid closet planners to engage in for us? Or do we want them to uphold the values, instill those values on the next generation of military planners, so that American values are what's projected to the world by our example, not by our hidden agenda? You know, thinking about Alaska strategically, and most Americans don't, but let's talk about Alaska just for a minute and how this feeds in to what's happening around the world. Firstly, Alaska is 18% of all the land in the United States. It has a greater coastline, Alaska alone. If you take all the western states, all the west coast, all the east coast, and all the Gulf Coast, and you add it all up, Alaska's coastline is bigger. And we have a 200-mile federal limit in those coastal waters, which is significant. Now, let's look at where Alaska sits on the map. Here's Alaska. Place Alaska just for a moment as if it were the top of the world. And then look at where it sits. North America. Here's LA. The same distance to LA, I hit Japan. The same distance, I hit Northern Europe. Same distance as for me as Alaskan to fly to Tokyo, to LA, or to Oslo. I can get there in virtually the same amount of time from Alaska, which is why Federal Express located their international hub in Anchorage, Alaska, and UPS put their international hub in Fairbanks, Alaska, because they could serve Asia, Europe, and the United States with the shortest distance between points, hubbing out of Alaska. Now, if you think about it, the Aleutian chain, which actually, you can't see it so easily on this, but it comes down right to here, and here's Japan. Okay? So Alaska to Japan is this distance. Alaska, I don't even hit Seattle. I can't get to the next state, but I can get to Japan. Now think about it. Raw materials coming out of Alaska, feeding the Pacific Rim, the best markets are to feed the Asian markets. Now there's no railroad link, so I mentioned yesterday, we can't get from Alaska into the Midwest. If we could link approximately right here at Prince Rupert, if we could link at Prince Rupert to the railroad system in Canada, we could then move Alaskan commodities all the way into the Midwest, the industrial belt, and be able to use those mineral commodities to do value-added and reindustrialize the nation. 1/4 of all the oil and gas left undiscovered in the world exists right here in the Arctic Circle. That's the estimate. Alaska has hundreds of trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. Now think about the North Slope of Alaska, which is right here where our oil and gas is. Now think about us moving oil and gas through an empty Arctic. The Arctic Sea is almost to the point where we can start to move freight from Europe to North America across the pole. Think about it. Instead of bringing freight from Europe to the United States, this distance, 1/3 of the way around the world, we can shorten that distance to 1/4 of its distance and move freight directly in to Northern Europe and into their rail systems, connecting into their commodity flow, or into Russia and Asia. Jumping over the poles with our freight, not just in the air, but in the sea. This will change everything and puts Alaska in the most strategic place because commodities are equal in price no matter where they're produced. The differences then become how cheap is it to get it to the next point. So we need rail to get it into the Midwest of the United States, where then it has the opportunity of being exported off of our western ports or through the St. Lawrence Seaway or off of our eastern ports, or we have the option in the not too distant future of shipping direct into these markets, raw goods, or adding value here in Alaska. Alaska has the greatest energy resources. All these minerals require energy for value added, and we have the opportunity to do that now. Now, what would that mean? If we began to move these commodities and these energy resources in the United States, half of our trade deficit is energy related and the other is buying value-added products back from China. If we could eliminate 50% of our trade deficits by eliminating imported energy, we strengthen the dollar again. We reinvigorate our economy again. We now have a domestic supply of energy, and we keep our money rolling in our own economies. The same is true with value added to our commodities. We have an opportunity to take a big chunk of our economy back from the rest of the world, embed it back into our nation, and use the advantage that we have. Alaska is the stepchild. Recognize our state. Recognize this place as an incredible opportunity for Americans to be liberated by looking at the balance sheet. Think about it. We always talk about the profit and loss statement, the income and expenses of the nation when we talk about the debt and how we're going to fix it. And it's always about the taxpayer and putting it on our backs. The balance sheet are the assets of the nation, which includes our energy resources, our mineral wealth, our force, our public lands. How do we make them pay in a way that offsets the Treasury demands against the taxpayer? Get full value for our commodities. Make sure those multinationals pay money here, because here's what happens, and we play it out in Alaska every year. Here we have oil and gas that the nation needs, and we have a pipeline that can run it down to Valdez, and the pipeline is running at 616,000 barrels a day today. It's designed to handle 2.1 million barrels. Why aren't we moving U.S. oil through a U.S. pipeline? Is because it's cheaper to corrupt a third world government somewhere else on the planet, keep the oil and gas in the ground in the U.S., because a multinational doesn't have any care about our national needs or our national priorities. It's about the bottom line. If it were a national oil company that cared first about the national priorities, then that oil and gas would be developed, would be feeding U.S. markets, even if it cost a little more, because the offset is U.S. jobs, U.S. taxes generated, U.S. rollover in our economy of every one of those dollars spent domestically 7 times. A 7 times multiplier in the economy and the tax base when we spend money at home. That's the difference. Bring it back because it's a domestic priority, not a multinational priority. Our domestic priorities need to carry forward, or these companies that are retaining these rights need to be put under performance. You know, these leases on the North Slope don't require any performance. They hold them, they pay the fee, they don't have to ever produce them. In Russia, if you didn't produce, you lost your right. Later they took them anyway, but at least they had the incentive. You're going to spend the money, you're going to produce these fields, or you're out of here. So they did. In the U.S., we don't make them produce anything. We just give them the right to tie up the public resource, call it their safety deposit box in our safe economy, because our men and women are defending this turf to defend them, to save their bacon after we're done trying to save it from whatever third world country they've corrupted. They always can come back home and produce it domestically, and by then they've screwed us down so much on the royalties and taxes under the guise of, well, if it's not cheap enough, we'll do it elsewhere. We understand all that. We know how economics works. We know how capitalism works. But we also understand how our national interests work, and multinational companies don't, because they don't care. It's not in their self-interest to care. They're looking at the 6 billion other consumers that don't live here, who are their potential future markets, because this economy, from their perspective, doesn't have those opportunities. It's dead. They want to go where people are changing from bicycles to automobiles, and that's the rest of the world. People have asked me, about my father. He was lost on a plane with Hale Boggs in the early 70s. Hale was a majority leader at the time. I mean, you can look at all of the interesting coincidences. The guy that took Hale Boggs to the airport, he was working in Texas at the time for another campaign, and Boggs got a ride to the airport by a young Democrat from Oklahoma, William Jefferson Clinton. Yeah, the same one that later became president. Now, this is 1972. Now, Boggs gets on the plane, he goes to D.C., makes a connection to Alaska, comes to Alaska, gives a speech, breaks the story a little bit about what was coming. We didn't know, it wasn't known as Watergate then, it was just this big scandal that he mentioned. And the next day he gets on a plane flying to Juneau from Anchorage and disappears and never heard from again with my father. Now, Boggs was on the Warren Commission. He wanted the Warren Commission reopened. It was saying so around that time. 6 months before, he had called for the resignation of Hoover, who he believed absolutely corrupt. Because of his own perversions, Hoover's, he used knowledge to blackmail the Congress. He had the inside track on every congressman because he had tapped their phones, intercepted their mail, basically violated all their personal privacy rights. And this was the leadership of the country, for goodness sakes. This is our entire Congress that he corrupted so that he could maintain his position in the FBI. Boggs wanted him out. Boggs came to Alaska. By then, Hoover was gone, but the plane disappears, the Hoover administration continues, the Warren Commission never reopens, and Watergate breaks 3 weeks later. October 16th, 1972, the plane goes down. McGovern's in his last throes of his death race because he isn't winning anything. Richard Nixon's the clear winner. Everybody knows it. Hale Boggs is a majority leader of the House, standing in line to be the next speaker, the third most powerful position in the Congress. And what happens? He disappears at the most critical time in our history. In fact, if you remember, what happened right after Watergate broke and then Agnew got bounced, as the vice president? Ford slid in behind him. Nixon resigns. Ford moves up. Ford pardons Nixon, and Rockefeller rolls in as the vice president. And then, if you remember, it was, I think it was Squeaky Fromm, wasn't it Squeaky Fromm? It was one of the Manson girls that takes a pot shot at Ford to knock him off because she wanted him dead, and who would have been president? Rockefeller. Now, isn't that interesting? Talk about conspiracy theory. How about conspiracy reality? That's how it played out. Everybody's forgotten it. If you're not 50, you don't remember. But a lot of us remember when all this happened. And it played out. Now, Boggs is off the scene. Carl Elbert is the speaker. Carl was an alcoholic. He's come to my house all the time, talked to my dad. The guy could barely sit on a bar stool, and he was Speaker of the House. Those were the days when you got stopped by the police for drunk driving, and they said, hey, drive on home and sleep it off. It was a different world in a different era. But Carl Elbert was not in a position at that time to step into the President of the United States. What I think would have happened had Boggs lived, Carl Elbert would have stepped down, Boggs would have stepped up, they would have got rid of Agnew and Nixon at the same time, and the third in line to be president would have been, and that would have been Hale Boggs, and the whole game would have changed in this country. And personal freedom and liberty would have been restored then, instead of going into disrepair even further now. Now, Dad brought Boggs to Alaska to campaign. Dad had that campaign in the bag. He brought him here to show him, to talk about the same issues, many of the same issues that we've talked about over this video. The idea that Alaska has this tremendous potential for the United States that ought to be realized. This was right before the native land claims, the biggest settlement in indigenous history in the United States. As a freshman congressman, my dad got passed a 44 million acre land transfer to indigenous people intact with mineral rights, oil and gas rights, energy rights, timber, surface estate, water rights, everything intact. And they moved that over along with just under $1 billion in 1971, the first year he was a member of Congress as a freshman. Now, people say freshmen can't get anything done. I know personally they're wrong. My brother Mark is a freshman senator, 2 years in the job. He's the fifth-ranking Democrat in the U.S. Senate and the only member of the U.S. Senate without a college degree. He did it in 2 years because he knows how to work hard, stand for something, and do something. Now, Mark and I don't agree on everything, as brothers never do, but I can tell you this. He's as committed to public service as I am. We have a different way of expressing it. But his risk at getting something done is as great or greater as they've ever been. You know, when you think about congressional deaths, you know, you think about my dad's, what happened is they found out in 1993 through FOIA requests that the military actually knew that my father or somebody at that crash site was alive. 2 people were alive, according to the FBI records that eventually got released. 2 people were alive at a crash site that has never been found. Crash site's never been publicly identified, nor has the people who were alive at that site. Lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. The documents we saw that roll call, prestigious publication in D.C., got under a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, all the key names were redacted. When we went after the data from the military, the Air Force overflights, the data that was developed for the biggest air and sea search in the history of the world, and all the records they told us were destroyed. A few months later, because we raised a lot of heck over that, a few months later, mysteriously on my brother's doorstep, a pile of boxes with all those original documents, not redated. Gee, they hadn't been destroyed at all. We've been lied to again. I want to tell you, as the son of a United States congressman, that if it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. That's why we need to get into this fight and engage our government. It shouldn't happen to anyone that our risk to our personal freedom, to our life, should be at risk as people give up their private life in order to carry on everyone else's. In the case of Wellstone, many remember his plane crash in Eveleth, Minnesota. You know, it just happened to be the same town my dad was born in. My uncle was a mayor there, was a state legislature there. Coincidence? Kind of interesting. Do you remember Carnahan, the senator before him that died in Missouri? That was the anniversary date of my dad's disappearance, October 16th. You know, is it coincidence? Maybe so, but it certainly begs the question, you know. I mean, how many people die in plane crashes? My brother beats Ted Stevens in an election. Ted Stevens dies in a plane crash a couple years later. What people don't remember is he was already in a plane crash before where his first wife was killed, died in a plane crash. People forget about it. Mike Gravel's wife died in a plane crash. People forget about it. You know, people forget about all of this, and yet it keeps happening. And people say, well, you know, politicians fly a lot, you know, that plane crash is a little disproportionate to the rest of the population. How about business travelers? You want to talk about people flying a lot. It seems to be one of the hazards of the job that congressmen and senators seem to die in plane crashes when they're about to make some of the biggest changes that the country needs. So, having said it, there's always risk involved, I suppose, in public service. But the questions become is, what risks are we taking as citizens? And what risks should we take? I mean, at least we should have our voices heard. At least we should speak out. At least we should participate in the activist organizations that we believe in, as long as they're functioning on reasonable, value-based approaches. I mean, violence isn't the answer. Certainly not the answer right now. That's the excuse the government needs to finally shut down what little is left of our personal liberty. Let's not give them that. But let's stay in the fight, and let's see what we can do together. Maybe we can, I believe we can, continue to make a difference as we actualize our own potentials and engage the fight from the standpoint of change.
Mind sciences, or the study of human behavior in relation to the mind, is the newest of all the arts. It's less than 100 years old. And it is by far the one that is most cloaked in secrecy.
The origins of psychological warfare were in Nazi Germany, and in the Nazi ideology they had something that was called Weltanschauungskrieg, which means worldview warfare. The idea for them was imposing the Nazi worldview on the countries that they had occupied. The Americans picked up this idea, created an American version of it, and called that psychological warfare. In trying to understand psychological warfare and in trying to understand the American approach to the post-war efforts to control people's minds, both as individuals and on a mass scale, there's a lot of illusions about how that was done. Were Nazis involved in that process? Yes, they were.
Project Paperclip was a United States government-sanctioned CIA operation for the importation of Nazi and fascist scientists into the United States. Their statement was simply this: if we don't bring these people into this country and contain them, then our enemies, the Soviet Union, will get them. The first wave was to bring these scientists. There was 700 odd propulsion scientists, and then there were some 600 and some odd mind sciences people that they brought in. The CIA was given the responsibility of actually placing the individuals out of Project Paperclip into the military-industrial complex, including our colleges and universities. Mind control was a psychological warfare weapon that Adolf Hitler regarded as the answer for taking over the entire planet. The name for the mind control research in this country was MK-Ultra.
MK-Ultra was one program of a series of programs that came out of the CIA to experiment with different types of mind control, using drugs, using electroshock, using insulin shock, and other techniques.
I think that the goal for those people who planned the program was very straightforward. It was an attempt to figure out a way to interrogate people and to learn how to protect their own agents against control by others. If you put someone in a position of being disabled by not feeding them or not allowing them to sleep or overwhelming them with sound, if you use massive shock treatment and you give people massive doses of drugs such as PCP or mescaline or amphetamines or LSD, and if you put them in periods of darkness where they can't predict from one minute to another what is going to happen next, so they're always dreading, there's no consistency to sort of what's going to happen, anybody can be put in a position of being open to brainwashing. Ewan Cameron was probably the foremost psychiatrist of his time in the 1950s. He was using high-tech sound techniques. He was using multiple kinds of loop recorders to force people to listen to recorded messages 24 hours a day for weeks on end to basically destroy people's thinking patterns.
injected the lysergic acid into the vein, and he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Now there, lassie, we'll see you later." And I started to feel very frightened, and the fright became a terror. And I sort of began throwing myself from one side of the room to the other. I didn't know what to do to stop this feeling. It felt like my bones were melting. That I just didn't know who I was anymore.
This is not just break-ins of people's homes. It's not just invasions of privacy by illegal wiretapping. This is an invasion of a person's mind. And that is about as profound an injury, except for loss of life, that the government can impose.
This was a post-Nazi program, if you will. It was an Americanization.
I've often made the statement, and I still make it flippantly. The Nazis didn't lose the war. They just had to move.
Now it's 50 years later. Now they're much more clever, they're much more sophisticated. They have a lot more money to spend.
Motor coordination was disrupted because of the compound's effect. Although his vision was not impaired, he found it difficult to focus his attention on the next objective. His physical actions were noticeably slower. He felt compelled to disobey his instructions.
Did Sergeant Ditches give you any instructions about what you were supposed to do tomorrow? Tomorrow? What is today, Thursday? Today's Thursday. Today's Thursday. Well...
Wars are not won on the battlefield. They're won in the minds of the people.